Welcome to Idaho State Police Forensic Services. Today we're going to host you on a tour of our Meridian facility. We hope that you learn something as we talk to our scientists about what they do in forensic science. We've transitioned to the latent print unit here at the Idaho State Police Forensic Services, and I'm talking with one of the supervisors of that unit. Can you tell us a little bit about what your scientists do in this section and why that's important to criminal justice?
The analysts in this section are tasked with processing evidence from state, federal, and local law enforcement agencies in an attempt to process the evidence for fingerprints, and then analysis and comparison of any fingerprints that are recovered. It lets the officers know that the person that we've identified the print to was present at the scene. Fingerprints are circumstantial evidence, so they don't tend to prove that the person committed the crime. They just tend to prove that the person was at the scene or handled the object. There are a number of factors that go into whether a print is usable or not. Certain people, such as myself, are not very good secretors. I don't tend to leave very good prints because I have very dry hands all the time. Other people tend to be very good secretors. They tend to have a lot of moisture in their skin and will leave behind good impressions. It also depends on how they actually touch the surface. If they've got a very strong grip, if they've got a very light touch, that tends to add a lot of distortion into the print. They become one big smushy mess. Items are often handled over and over again. So if I lay down a print, it may be a really great print, but then somebody comes behind me, touches the item, and they're actually smudging through and adding their own prints to the mix. The first thing she would do would be to examine the items for any visible prints. Occasionally, we are able to visualize prints without any processing. If that were to be the case, then she would mark them and photograph them. Generally, if we're going to use chemical techniques, that will be done prior to any powder processing. This analyst is about to place these cans into the superglue fuming chamber. She would then take the cans and suspend them in the superglue fuming chamber. To make sure that our equipment are working properly, she took a piece of small plastic and then she placed her own print onto it. The fumes rising off of the heated superglue would then adhere to any latent prints that were on the item. Occasionally we'll get items of evidence that are too large to fit in the small chamber, where we've needed to construct a chamber out of PVC pipe and plastic. We also have this larger superglue chamber, so if we get in something like a safe or a bicycle frame, we have the ability to glue in this larger chamber. Our third type of glue chamber is a vacuum chamber. We've got a couple of different sizes available here in our laboratory. This one's designed for a long gun or a rifle. We'll put the item in along with some liquid glue. A vacuum will be introduced and it'll actually allow the superglue fumes to infiltrate into all the small crevices. Once the fuming process has completed, the analyst can then remove the items. This is her control print here. You can see a very clear white colored film on the control, so she knows her instrument worked. She can take her items out and start examining them for any latent prints that she may have developed with the superglue. She would then move on to applying a dye stain solution. Once it's dried, we can then take it and view it with a high-intensity light source that utilizes different colors of filters and goggles to view the prints that are on the item. In our chemical processing lab is where we apply all of our wet chemicals. We're looking at those surfaces that absorb water. And this analyst is applying the chemical to the paper. He'll allow it to completely dry for a few minutes, and then we'll subject the chemical to heat and humidity. There are a couple of different ways. One is your common household steam iron. The combination of the heat and humidity is developing a purple colored print onto this item of evidence. That print could then be scanned or photographed. But when we've got a lot of items or bigger items, we also have a more sophisticated heat and humidity chamber. We can control the exact temperature and the amount of humidity. In our powder processing lab, analysts will process items of evidence using different types of powder. Powder does tend to be the last step we would use in a sequence. This analyst is using a magnetic powder and then brush those onto the surface of the item. Once she's developed a print, she will mark it and give it a number associated with that item and that print. And then she will apply tape to the surface, smoothing out any air bubbles or creases in the tape. And then she will remove the tape from the surface and place it onto what is known as a lift card. The analyst will document which techniques they used, what order they were used in, the dates they used them on, and then what the results of that particular analysis were. We get all types of items coming into the laboratory. With crimes against persons, we will get anything from a baseball bat to a machete to small knives, guns. Property crime is those burglaries or robberies, situations where items tend to be taken. A lot of times there will be lift cards that the agency actually processed and lifted at the scene that they'll then send into the laboratory. Powder tends to be used on non-porous surfaces, so those surfaces that don't absorb water. Anything that's made out of glass, plastic. The average item, we maybe get 2 to 3 lifts, but sometimes we may get dozens or even upwards of 50 prints off of one item. And it really depends on the surface area that's available and the quality of the prints that were left behind. So once the analyst has developed a print, the next step would be marking and photography to show where the print was on the item, but then also do close-up photography of the print. And sometimes you can get a really excellent photo just by varying the angle or direction of the light across the surface. These are the superglue developed prints. These tend to be very detailed. You can see the actual edge shapes and pores present in the prints. Once the item has been irrigated with the dye stain, rinsed and allowed to dry, the analyst will photograph any prints that were developed. This particular chemical is rhodamine 6G. You can actually see that she developed an entire palm print. That's pretty unusual to be able to get a full palm print. Once the analyst has processed the item and they've taken their photographs, the next step would be to do a visual examination of the prints. We use a lot of digital imaging to enhance that photography. We're generally comparing prints to an inked print, and so the ridges are going to be black, so it tends to be a little bit easier on the examiner's eyes if they can compare a black ridge to a black ridge. We tend to use a lot of Adobe Photoshop, but we also have a software system that allows us to track everything that's being done to our images. We always have the original copy. We can always be challenged on our techniques anytime in court. So we don't want to be using any techniques that may introduce artifacts into the image that aren't actually there. Artifacts could be misinterpreted as features in the print, which would lead to an incorrect conclusion. So we don't want to be doing that. No two persons have been found to have the same fingerprints. Because fingerprints are very partial in nature, it isn't inconceivable that another person could have a very similar area in their friction-ridged skin. When we're looking at prints, we're looking at a number of things. What the pattern type is. This appears to be a fingertip print. We tend to look for 3 types of features: bifurcations, and that's when a ridge forks into 2, then dots, ending ridges flows through and then stops abruptly. We look at creases, the distortion that may be present in the print. This print is a whorl type pattern. It's kind of circular in shape. We want to have an adequate amount of features that we believe no 2 people would share that number of features and clarity in common. Here is our multimodal biometric identification system. Down the road, it will be used for things like facial identification or iris identification. There's a perception that we feed the prints in and then out comes the suspect, and there's a lot more that goes into it. It's not as automated as people perceive it to be. This analyst is bringing a print in, clip it to focus on the area of interest. They'll go in and mark those points, ending ridges, or dots. We'll let the computer take its best guess, but the analyst has to go back and check that those points are correct. She'll do what's known as zoning. If there were areas of distortion in this print, she would be zoning those out. A lot of times when we're running a fingerprint, we need to try and tell the print which direction is up, and we need to tell it where its approximate core is. Once that's done, we would proceed to the inquiry section. So we're going to tell it that we want it to search as a fingerprint, and then we're going to tell it to search Idaho only. We can search the other states that are surrounding us as databases, not just our own. It's going to give us a candidate list. Then the analyst is going to go in and try to determine, did the computer make the correct assumption that these 2 prints were made by the same person? And so she'll go back and forth between the latent print and the known print, trying to identify additional features. She's double checking the number of ridges that occur in between those features, looking for both similarities and differences. Sometimes it's easier to spot the differences than it is the similarities. The system doesn't make the call. It's really the latent fingerprint analyst who is making the decision of, did the system identify the correct person or not? If the correct person isn't in the database, then we'll do what's known as a no-hit. That latent print will actually stay in the system. Occasionally, we maybe input a print today, and then the actual contributor of the print is arrested. Their fingerprints go into the criminal history files, and then we'll get a hit maybe 2 or 3 years out. A typical training program in latent prints tends to be 2 to 3 years. Analysts are required to come in with a bachelor's degree. Generally, we prefer that to be in a biology or a chemistry.
Thank you for joining us on our tour of Idaho State Police Forensic Services. We hope that you learned something and found it informative. We hope that you learned of our commitment to sound science and serving the citizens of the state of Idaho.